Hello, my name is Boris Pismeni, and today I'm going to talk about autonomous NIC offloads and how to accelerate data-intensive applications over TCP without offloading TCP itself to the hardware. This work was a joint effort of researchers from Technion, Tel Aviv University, VMware, and NVIDIA. We focus on layer 5 protocols over TCP/IP that perform some data-intensive computations and present a framework to accelerate these. There are many examples of such protocols and computations, and most of them are autonomously offloadable, but not all. In this talk, we use the TLS protocol, which performs data encryption, decryption, and authentication as an example for an autonomous offload. While in the paper, we also describe NVMe TCP copy and data digest offloads. So what is TLS? TLS is the most popular way to encrypt TCP traffic. It has two stages, a handshake and a data transfer. And as we are focused on data-intensive computations, we are going to focus on the data transfer stage. We classify the design space of layer 5 protocol acceleration as follows. First, software acceleration can improve performance by optimizing across layers and breaking abstractions to reduce their overhead. But these cannot accelerate data-intensive computations. Second, on-CPU acceleration, using dedicated instructions that crunch data more effectively, can improve performance as well, but these may still account for a significant fraction of the layer 5 protocol CPU cycles. Third, off-CPU acceleration, using external PCIe accelerators such as the Intel Quick Assist card, move computation outside of the CPU to avoid the CPU cycle overheads, but these require significant parallelism to perform well and introduce some overhead of their own when they transfer data between accelerator and CPU memory. Fourth, dependent NIC offloads, such as TCP offload engines, accelerate applications effectively. However, they depend on offloading the TCP/IP stack, which is undesirable as it's constantly evolving. Our approach, autonomous NIC offloads, accelerates application computation without subsuming the TCP/IP stack. Instead, the NIC and the application cooperate to offload computation transparently to the TCP/IP stack. In autonomous offload, we require direct communication between the NIC driver and the software layer 5 protocol. So for TLS, we build the offload on top of kernel TLS, and therefore we will briefly describe how kernel TLS works. Before kernel TLS, applications transmitting data passed it on to the TLS library, which encrypted it, and then placed it within a message with a header and a trailer. Thereafter, to send data over TCP, the TLS library calls a system call, which copies the data between the user buffer and the kernel buffer. Thus, we have two passes over the data, one to encrypt and another to copy. To optimize this, the implementation of kernel TLS combines the encrypt and copy operations. This cross-layer optimization performs one pass over the data instead of two. Also, kernel TLS allows direct hardware access from the TLS layer, which is required for efficient hardware acceleration. In contrast to software, autonomous TLS offload eliminates the encryption operation on the CPU and performs it in NIC hardware instead. In other words, kernel TLS wraps application data in TLS records and pushes these to TCP, skipping the encryption and authentication of data. Kernel TLS provides placeholders for buffers filled by the authentication process, such as the trailer. The offload is transparent to the TCP/IP stack, which is unmodified and unaware of kernel TLS. Thereafter, the NIC encrypts data in place as data is being sent to the wire, while filling placeholders according to its computation. Finally, the offload interoperates with all Linux networking utilities, such as TCP dump, quality of service, etc. To understand autonomous offloads better, we present some background on the TLS protocol. TLS is a layer 5 protocol that encapsulates user data in records of at most 16 kilobytes. Each record has its own header and trailer. Record headers consist of the following fields: 1 byte for type, 2 bytes for version, 2 bytes for size, 8 bytes for the initialization vector, at most 16 kilobytes for the encrypted payload, and an additional 8 bytes of trailer that contain the integrity check value, which is the authentication result of the entire message. These records are sent over TCP, where each byte has its own TCP sequence number. Now that we understand the protocol, let's look at how encryption works. We will focus on the ASGCM cipher, which is the most popular. In the ASGCM cipher, TLS encrypts each record using the per stream key and the per record IV as follows. First, we take the record's IV and we concatenate it with a counter. Then, we encrypt that using an AES block that produces 16 bytes of keystream. Then the keystream is used to convert between plaintext and ciphertext using the XOR operation. In this manner, we encrypt all message bytes, incrementing the IV's counter for each 16-byte chunk of data. Now to calculate the ICV, we encrypt a block of zeros and multiply it with the header and all ciphertext blocks. So now that we understand TLS encryption and record construction, let's consider the properties of this computation. First, we observe that we can compute encryption and authentication incrementally from left to right as we receive in-order message bytes. Never will we need to look ahead into the subsequent bytes of the message to encrypt the current block. Second, observe that computation is byte granular on the input. In other words, we can encrypt and decrypt any message subsequence by computing its corresponding keystream and XORing it with the data. Third, encryption is size preserving, as each byte of input corresponds to exactly 1 byte of output, and this enables us to process TCP packet payload in place. Finally, encryption is independent across messages, as it depends only on the key and IV. This will enable us to recover efficiently from loss and reordering. We now present how offload works for transmitting in-sequence data, again using TLS as an example. The offload uses 2 NIC hardware contexts per flow, one for receive and another for transmit. Each context consists of a static context that is constant throughout the flow's lifetime, and a dynamic context that changes with each received packet. The static context holds the encryption key, while the dynamic context holds the state required to encrypt the next expected TCP sequence number, its offset within the message, and the current message's size, IV, and accumulating ICV state. So when packets arrive in sequence, the expected sequence number will always match the dynamic context, and NIC hardware will always hold the necessary information to encrypt data in place. Let's consider what happens when the NIC is requested to offload an out-of-sequence packet. For example, if TCP packet 5 is retransmitted after TCP packet 8, then the NIC hardware dynamic context does not match the packet. We identify this case in the NIC's driver transmit routine before sending the packet, and then the driver recovers the dynamic state to offload the out-of-sequence packet. To recover the context, the NIC driver needs to feed NIC hardware with the TLS record prefix of the retransmitted packet. For packet 5, it is the data of TLS record 2 that is within TCP packets 4 and 3. To obtain this data, the driver calls up to kernel TLS, which holds references on all TLS record data in the TCP transmit buffer, and maps this to TCP sequence numbers. In addition to serving NIC driver requests, kernel TLS record data references are also used to ensure that TCP releases data only when complete records are acknowledged, as otherwise data required for recovery may be released too soon. We now present how offload works on receive. Similarly to the transmit side, the offload of in-sequence packets is straightforward. We incrementally decrypt data within each packet as it arrives, replacing the data of the original packet with decrypted data. It's worth mentioning that hardware reports 1 bit per packet that indicates whether all data within a packet is decrypted and authenticated successfully. We now move to describe what happens for various out-of-sequence scenarios. For instance, consider what happens when a packet is retransmitted. Here packet 2 is received after packet 4. In this case, the packet is passed to software unmodified as it does not match the dynamic context expected TCP sequence number. And if this packet reaches software, the kernel TLS will need to handle it, falling back to software decryption. Let's consider a different scenario. Here, TLS record data is reordered, such that after packet 1, the NIC expects packet 2, but instead packets 3, 4, and 5 are received, and only then packet 2 arrives. So in this case, when the NIC receives packet 3, it cannot decrypt this packet, as the packet does not match the NIC's expected TCP sequence number. However, not all is lost. To recover the offload, the NIC finds the TLS record header within packet 3, using the length field of the TLS record header in packet 1. Then, using this flash TLS record header, the NIC updates its dynamic context to expect and decrypt TCP packets 4, 5, and 6 when they arrive in sequence. The real problem is TLS record header reordering. Here, after TCP packets 1 and 2, the NIC expects packet 3, but packets 4 and 5 arrive instead. The NIC knows nothing of packet 4, and as it could contain any number of TLS record headers, the offload stops and requires software assistance to recover. Recovering the context on receive is harder, simply because packets continue to arrive and NIC hardware has no control over that. As traffic continues to flow, software cannot point hardware to the position of TLS records within the TCP byte stream, as any TLS record header observed by software is stale compared to packets observed by hardware. To handle context recovery on receive, we combine software and hardware as follows. First, the NIC hardware speculatively finds a TLS record header within the TCP byte stream using a magic pattern that consists of the TLS application data type and version. So following the previous example, after we lost packet 3, we will speculatively identify the TLS header within packet 5. Then, NIC hardware requests software to confirm that indeed it is a TLS header. As software will eventually see all packets in sequence, it will be able to respond to that query. Meanwhile, packets continue to arrive, and NIC hardware uses the TLS record size in the speculatively found header to track subsequent message header patterns. And if indeed it is a TLS record header, then tracking will be successful as long as message headers arrive in sequence. Finally, at some point in the future, software will confirm that it was a TLS record header in packet 5, and NIC hardware will resume offloading. In this manner, we enable software to respond about packet 5, while packets continue to arrive in hardware. Now that we understand the offload on transmit and receive, we take a step back and consider what properties make computations and protocols autonomously offloadable. We find that most computations are autonomously offloadable, but not all, and most protocols are autonomously offloadable, but not all. Let's see what are the properties required for autonomously offloadable computations. The first property is that on transmit, the offload must be size preserving, preventing compression offloads. We'll use an example to show why this is the case. Assume we have a non-size preserving offload on transmit, and we have host A with an offloading NIC that inflates messages. One example of this is adding TLS message headers and trailers. So the software on host A sends 150 bytes, and since NIC offload adds 50 more bytes, and these do not fit in the same packet, the NIC sends another packet with the additional 50 bytes. Thereafter, host B receives the data and acknowledges all of it. However, the latter ACK is lost. Thereafter, the NIC on host A receives all packets and passes them to software. But now we have a problem. TCP on host A thinks that all data is acknowledged, and only the NIC on host A knows that some data was lost. And so the offloading NIC must take upon itself the responsibility of reliable data delivery for bytes that it adds. This undesirable complexity is what we seek to avoid with autonomous offloads, and therefore we disallow it. Additionally, we need the offload to be computable on TCP packets of any size, as we cannot delay or drop packets. In other words, we require computations to be byte granular
and size preserving. This precludes the offload of ASCBC as it requires blocks of 16 bytes to compute. Moreover, we require that the state for computation be constant and independent across messages, except possibly some metadata such as the number of previous messages or their sequence numbers. That's all. So to summarize, many computations fit these requirements, including encryption, decryption, data digest, copy, and pattern matching. We also asked ourselves what layer 5 protocols are autonomously offloadable. First, we require protocols to use headers with a length field, which is crucial for NICs to identify message boundaries and to track them. Second, we require protocol headers to contain a field that is visible on the wire and can be used to speculatively identify messages. For example, message types can be sufficient as there are very few valid options. The only protocol we know of that violates this property is SSH, which encrypts its headers. To summarize, there are many protocols that fit this model, including HTTP, Memcache, iSCSI, gRPC, and Thrift. Our TLS offload implementation is available in Mellanox Connectix 6 leaked NICs, with changes to OpenSSL, the Linux kernel, and Mellanox driver already upstream. We now move to discuss the evaluation. To demonstrate the benefit of autonomous TLS offload, we break down the CPU cycles consumed by x86 AS&I TLS encryption using the ASGCM cipher. For this analysis, we modify the IPELF benchmark to use OpenSSL, and we then measure the performance on a single core. The results show that bigger TLS records reduce the overhead of the network stack, and thus will benefit more from offloading TLS. Additionally, we observe that the network stack works harder on receive compared to transmit. Thus, the potential benefit on transmit is higher. We also verified that real TLS offloading gains correspond to the eliminated cycles for encryption. To measure the effects of loss on transmit, we measure the performance of IPELF while dropping packets on the receiver. As we can see in the figure on the left, transmit offload is resilient to loss, as in all experiments it is at most 11% below TCP performance. And the performance of offload is always better compared to the baseline of TLS in software. We note that the gap between TLS and TCP shrinks as we increase the loss rate, and this is because the overall throughput of TCP decreases as we increase the loss rate. Additionally, as the loss rate increases, the NIC consumes larger amounts of PCIe bandwidth to recover offload context, and this is the overhead we show in the figure on the right, as a portion of total available PCIe bandwidth. As the figure shows, even with 5% loss, context recovery costs no more than 2.5% of total PCIe bandwidth. We also measure the overheads of loss on receive, where we measure the performance of IPELF while dropping packets on the sender. As we can see in the figure on the left, drops are much costlier at the receiving end when offloading, which is why the offload curve rapidly gets closer to the software TLS curve. Additionally, we break down the received TLS records according to fully offloaded records, partially offloaded records that require software fallback for at least one of the records packets, and entirely unoffloaded records that are processed by software. And we present the results in the figure on the left. As we can see, even with 5% loss, more than half of the records are fully offloaded, which highlights the effectiveness of the NIC's context recovery.
In conclusion, we designed a new framework called Autonomous NIC Offloads for accelerating Layer 5 protocol computations in cooperation with software TCP. We implemented support for TLS crypto offload and NVMe TCP copy and digest offloads in Mellanox NICs. Our evaluation of autonomous offloads shows that they can improve throughput by up to 3.3x, reduce CPU utilization by up to 60%, and improve latency by up to 30%. Thank you for listening to my talk. Feel free to reach out to me about any question you have about the paper or about using our autonomous NIC offloads.